The courtroom was nearly full, quiet but restless. A black man stood alone near the benches, tall, calm, wearing a worn gray suit. He held no phone, no folder, just folded hands and a silence that made people uneasy. A white officer near the front smirked, leaned in toward another deputy and said loud enough to carry, "Looks like somebody dressed himself in the dark." A few chuckles followed. Another officer added, "Maybe he's here to clean the floors." They laughed without shame. The man didn't flinch. He wasn't cuffed. He wasn't on trial. He was simply waiting. The bailiff ignored the murmurs. A clerk glanced up, then quickly looked away. And then the door opened. The judge stepped in, black robe flowing, heels clicking softly. The room rose, but when her eyes met the man's, something changed. She paused for a fraction of a second, then spoke with warmth the room had never heard from her before. "Thank you for waiting, sweetheart." The courtroom froze, because the man they mocked, he was her husband. "Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today?" Comment below. Marcus Brooks believed in the law the way some people believe in scripture, not because it was perfect, but because it should be. He had spent the better part of his adult life defending others, especially those who looked like him, from a system that often saw black men as threats before it saw them as people. But no degree, no court victories, and no polished credentials could protect him from what happened that Tuesday morning. It began outside a coffee shop in a mostly white neighborhood on the city's north side. Marcus had just finished a morning jog, still in his track pants and hoodie, waiting in line when a white woman walking her dog accused him of standing too close. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived. No one asked Marcus for his side. One officer barked orders while the other wrote him a citation for disorderly conduct, claiming he had made a scene. He hadn't spoken a single raised word. Most would have paid the fine just to be done with it. But Marcus had spent years defending clients punished for being silent. He wasn't going to let this pass. He filed for a court date and requested a hearing to contest the citation. Not to prove he was innocent, he already knew that, but to document what had happened in public record. He didn't want revenge, he wanted acknowledgement. A line in a file that said, "This wasn't right." When the hearing was scheduled, the court assigned it randomly to one of the downtown dockets. It never occurred to Marcus that it would fall on the same calendar as Judge Angela Brooks, his wife. They had kept their relationship discreet within the courthouse, not secret but private. She was a respected judge, known for her clear rulings and clipped tone. He was a civil rights attorney with a calm fire that disarmed even the most aggressive prosecutors. Their bond had grown over late nights spent reading old case files and early mornings trading stories of quiet wins and deeper frustrations. Marcus knew the risks. He made sure to file the hearing under his name alone and informed the clerk in advance that if assigned to his wife's docket, it would require reassignment. That was policy. That was fairness. But somewhere between filing and scheduling, something was overlooked. Or maybe someone thought the name Brooks was a coincidence. Either way, the hearing landed on Angela's bench. Marcus arrived early, not out of nervousness but habit. He wore a modest suit, carried no briefcase, and sat quietly in the back row. As each person entered, officers, clerks, attorneys, he watched the familiar rhythm of the room unfold. But there was something different this time. The glances lasted longer. The dismissals came quicker. No one recognized him as an attorney. No one even asked who he was. One officer looked him up and down and shook his head like he'd just seen something out of place. Another made a remark under his breath about county wasting resources on these people. Marcus stayed still. His eyes watched. His breath stayed even. He had walked into many courtrooms before, but this one felt colder, and the judge had not yet entered. Marcus sat alone on the back bench, his hands resting lightly on his lap. The room was beginning to fill. Most defendants were seated closer to the front, but no one had guided him there. The bailiff had gestured vaguely toward the back without looking up, as if his presence didn't warrant specifics. He had been early, 10 minutes early in fact, yet 3 other people who arrived after him had already been called. One woman with a speeding ticket was let off with a warning. A man charged with petty theft was granted a payment plan and allowed to leave. Marcus remained still as his name was skipped. A young white intern wearing a navy lanyard approached him with an awkward half-smile. She crouched slightly, lowering her voice as if speaking to someone unsure of the system. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you here to testify in one of the later hearings? Or are you in the wrong courtroom, maybe?" Marcus turned to her gently. "No," he said, his voice level. "I'm here for my own hearing." Her face flushed. She muttered something that sounded like an apology before retreating back toward the clerk's table. Behind him, 2 officers leaned on the wall, arms folded. One of them nodded in Marcus's direction and said, "Bet he's here about loitering or noise, something minor. But he's dressed like he's got somewhere to be." The other one chuckled. "That suit, please, looks like he borrowed it off. A mannequin at a thrift shop." Marcus heard it. Everyone within a few feet could. No one said a word. The comments weren't new. He had heard worse. What struck deeper was the casualness of it, the comfort with which they mocked him, as if there were no chance, no possibility, that he could be more than what they imagined. The clerk finally called his name. "Marcus Brooks?" He stood. The bailiff looked at him, expression unchanged, and said, "Step forward and wait by the rail." As he walked down the aisle, one officer muttered under his breath, "Here we go." Marcus stood by the rail, back straight, eyes forward. The clerk shuffled papers. A few more defendants were called ahead of him, despite the order. The bailiff mispronounced his name again, Brooks, with an exaggerated S at the end, then smiled to himself as if proud of the slight. Still, Marcus didn't react. Not with a frown, not with a shake of his head. Only the steady blinking of his eyes gave any sign that he was registering what was unfolding. The door to the side chamber remained closed. Judge Angela Brooks was running late. The chatter in the room grew looser. Some whispered, others laughed softly. One attorney leaned over and asked the bailiff what this guy's case was about. The bailiff shrugged. "Disorderly. Probably. Mouthed off at the wrong person." The attorney nodded. "Figures." A few people glanced at Marcus again, this time with something colder in their eyes. Not cruelty exactly, but indifference. The kind of gaze that made a person disappear. The intern approached the bench, whispered something to the clerk. They shared a look and nodded, flipping through the docket. The 2 officers against the wall hadn't stopped staring. One took out his phone and scrolled casually. The other tilted his head, arms still folded, and said, "I swear they just let anybody in here now." At that moment, the door at the front of the courtroom clicked open. Everyone stood. Judge Angela Brooks entered. Black robe pressed, eyes scanning the room quickly. She nodded at the clerk and approached the bench with her usual crisp pace. She took her seat, adjusted her microphone, and opened the docket folder. Then she looked up. Her eyes landed on Marcus, just for a moment. Just long enough for something to flicker behind her composed expression. She looked back at the docket. Something. Inside the room shifted. She cleared her throat. Her voice, usually clipped and direct, came out softer, almost careful. "Mr. Marcus Brooks," she said, "please approach the bench." The officers stopped whispering. The bailiff looked up. The intern turned slightly in her seat. Marcus stepped forward. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around. His steps were slow and sure, the sound of his shoes echoing lightly against the courtroom floor. And as he passed the officers who had mocked him, their faces began to change. Not from guilt, not yet, but from uncertainty, because the man they had laughed at was walking like he belonged. And the judge, who barely blinked at most defendants, was watching him the way no one expected, like she knew him, like he mattered, like something was about to shift, and they weren't ready. The courtroom had stilled, but the air was tense. Marcus reached the bench and stood silently, waiting. Judge Brooks kept her gaze on the docket, flipping through the pages slowly. She read his case summary, though she already knew it by heart. Behind him, the same officer who had whispered jokes leaned close to his colleague again and muttered, Let's see what this clown has to say for himself. Marcus heard it. So did the clerk. But no one moved. No one objected. The power in that room had always tilted in one direction. They were sure it still did. Judge Brooks looked up again. Her face was unreadable, not cold, but carved in something firmer than stone. She tapped her pen against the bench once, then leaned slightly forward. Her voice was formal. Mr. Marcus Brooks, this matter involves a citation for disorderly conduct issued on March 12th. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus replied calmly. A slight murmur rippled from the gallery behind him. Even in his stillness, there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. His tone didn't match their assumptions. His posture didn't match the role they had assigned him. She nodded slowly. Then she placed her pen down with care. The court acknowledges that the presiding judge, myself, is related to the defendant by marriage, she said. The words dropped like a stone into water. The courtroom did not gasp. It did not shout. But something broke. An invisible structure, the one they'd all been leaning on, cracked at its base. Angela continued, As such, I will be recusing myself from this matter. The case will be reassigned to another judge, and proceedings will be rescheduled. No anger, no drama, just calm, precise instruction. But she wasn't finished. Before we conclude, she said, eyes shifting briefly toward the bailiff and the cluster of officers, I am noting for the record a concern regarding the conduct of certain courtroom personnel during today's proceedings. The officer who had whispered jokes now stood stiff, staring forward. His skin had paled, his lips pressed into a tight line. Angela didn't call him out by name. She didn't need to. She closed the docket and looked directly at Marcus. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Brooks. The courtroom was still, not just quiet, but still like the space itself was holding its breath. Marcus nodded once, not a bow, not a thank you, just a recognition that the line had been drawn. He turned and walked away, each step deliberate. He passed the clerk, the intern, the officers, and though no one said a word, they were no longer looking at a man to be laughed at. They were looking at a man they had misjudged, publicly. Back at the bench, Angela remained composed. She tapped her gavel once. Court is in recess. The sound echoed louder than it needed to. The hearing was over, but no one in that room would forget it. The courtroom emptied slowly. Some left in silence. Others lingered, murmuring quietly, trying to stitch together what they had just witnessed. There had been no yelling, no confrontation, yet somehow the walls had shifted. The authority that once felt so untouchable now felt exposed. Judge Brooks remained seated at the bench for a few moments longer, her hands still, her eyes steady. She had not raised her voice. She had not named names, but her words had cut through the room like a clean blade. The clerk walked over quietly. Would you like to push the rest of the morning's docket, Judge Brooks? She asked, her voice cautious now. Angela shook her head. We'll proceed. By the time Marcus reached the exit, the hallway outside had begun to buzz. A few legal aides whispered. One intern stared. An officer held the door open but didn't make eye contact. No one laughed anymore. News traveled fast inside a courthouse. Within the hour, word had spread to the other floors. Not just about the case, but about who Marcus was. A civil rights attorney. A man who had gone to Harvard Law. A man who had defended dozens of clients in this very building. A man whose wife wore the robe that so many had assumed would never belong to someone who loved him. Later that afternoon, an email quietly circulated among the senior judges and administrative staff. Judge Brooks had filed a formal request for review, citing observable and audible misconduct by court officers in open session. She requested that courtroom microphones and security footage be pulled for internal affairs to examine. Her request was signed and logged within the hour. The officer who had mocked Marcus spent the rest of his shift in the break room, waiting for the call he knew would come. His badge felt heavier than usual. His jokes from earlier in the day replayed in his mind, each one souring faster than the last. There were no grand consequences, no suspensions that day. But the shift had begun. A few days later, posters were hung near the security checkpoints at the courthouse entrance. They read, "Every person who walks into this courtroom will be treated with dignity. Disrespect will not be tolerated. Accountability begins at the door." Judge Brooks did not issue a press statement. She declined interviews, but a memo quietly made its way into the training materials for all new bailiffs, interns, and deputies. A judge once recused herself from a case involving her husband, but not before reminding the room that titles don't make someone worthy of respect. Character does. Marcus never said a word publicly about what happened, but from then on, when he entered the courthouse, no one asked if he was in the right room, no one questioned his suit, no one mistook his silence for weakness, and when the officer who had mocked him passed him in the hallway a week later, he nodded stiffly. Marcus didn't return the gesture. He didn't need to. His dignity had already answered. Have you ever been judged for how you look or where you're from? Share your story in the comments. We read everyone and they matter. The formal review began the next Monday. Internal Affairs quietly requested the courtroom footage and microphone recordings. There was no press release, no public scandal, just an email sent to department heads with the subject line, "Incident, Courtroom B, Conduct Review." Within hours, the mood inside the courthouse shifted from idle routine to quiet caution. The audio was clear. The microphones, installed near the front benches and gallery for official records, had picked up more than just procedural dialogue. The laughter, the mocking, the words thrift store and clown. All of it was logged, time-stamped, and archived. One officer, Sergeant Mason, the one who had leaned in with the jokes, was placed on administrative leave while the review proceeded. He was told not to return to courtroom duty until the matter was resolved. His partner, who had laughed but said less, was reassigned to desk duty. None of it made headlines. But inside those halls, it made ripples. The judge's report also referenced broader issues. Defendants called out of order based on appearance, mispronunciations repeated even after correction, subtle acts of disrespect that added up to something heavier. And this time, someone had noticed. Someone in a robe. Angela Brooks did not return to that courtroom for the rest of the week. Her docket was reassigned. She spent her mornings reviewing case files in chambers, and her afternoons meeting with the chief judge and the court's internal policy advisors. She wasn't angry. She wasn't asking for punishment. She was asking for standards. And quietly, she was being heard. The next week, a training session was added to the monthly courthouse schedule, mandatory for all courtroom staff. It focused on racial bias in courtroom interaction. It wasn't radical. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Marcus received a quiet phone call from the court administrator 2 days later, the man on the other, and offered a formal apology for the procedural inconsistencies and personnel behavior that had occurred during his hearing. Marcus listened. He said thank you. He said he appreciated the call, but he didn't say much more. He didn't have to. Change had already started moving. Later that month, a new policy was implemented. Defendants could now submit anonymous feedback forms about courtroom behavior, including treatment by officers, clerks, and legal staff. It wasn't a sweeping reform, but it gave people something they hadn't had before, a record of how they were treated. A voice, even without volume. Back in her chambers, Judge Brooks met privately with 3 younger judges. They asked her what it felt like to be on that bench, looking at her husband while others disrespected him. Angela had answered simply, "Like watching someone walk through fire, knowing you can't carry them, only clear the path." One afternoon, a folded envelope was slipped into Marcus's mail slot at the courthouse. No return name. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were, but that's the problem. I should have treated you with respect either way. I'm learning." A clerk? He didn't tell anyone about the note. He tucked it into a book on his shelf and never mentioned it again, but he remembered. He remembered every face in that room, every word said, and every pair of eyes that lowered when the truth was revealed. Not because he was a judge's husband, but because he was a man who deserved better long before they knew who he was. And now, some of them were beginning to understand that. Not all, but some, and that was how change always started. Quietly, like a seed taking root in a courtroom full of stone. 3 weeks after the hearing, Marcus's citation was dismissed in a different courtroom across the hall. The new judge, an older black man named Judge Harris, read through the incident report and listened for less than 10 minutes before closing the file with a sharp, deliberate motion. "There should have been no citation," he said flatly. "The court apologizes for the misuse of your time." Marcus nodded once. He said nothing else. There was no smile, no look of relief, only the same quiet composure he'd held from the beginning. But Judge Harris saw it, the steady weight of dignity, carried across injustice. Back at the precinct, the officer who had mocked Marcus returned to work, not to his old courtroom post, but to a back office assignment. His days were filled with paperwork, policy review, and the slow grind of administrative oversight. A permanent note had been added to his file: conduct unbecoming of a courtroom. Officer documented verbal misconduct, required completion of racial equity training. He took the classes, he signed the papers. But something had changed in him too. Not repentance, not fully, but caution, awareness, the sting of having made a mistake in front of power he hadn't seen coming. The courthouse itself began to shift, slowly. Clerks who used to roll their eyes at difficult names now double-checked their pronunciation. Bailiffs, once quick to herd defendants like cattle, began to ask more softly, gesture more clearly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. But something in the atmosphere had cooled. The quiet arrogance had thinned. A small laminated card was placed on the front of every judge's bench. Dignity is not optional. Every person matters. No one made an announcement. No ceremony. Just the cards, sitting silently where the law is spoken. New interns were now required to attend a racial awareness seminar during their first week. The example used in the first session wasn't hypothetical. The instructor told the story plainly. A respected black attorney was mocked by officers and mistaken for a defendant. He was the judge's husband, but it shouldn't have taken that to deserve respect. They didn't use names, but everyone knew. Marcus and Angela never spoke publicly about the incident. When reporters called, they declined interviews. When colleagues tried to bring it up casually over coffee or in shared elevators, they let silence do the answering. But once a week, Marcus still came to the courthouse for hearings, meetings, or quiet legal work. He walked through security without hassle now. The guards nodded. The officers stood a little straighter when he passed. One afternoon, a young Latina woman in court for a housing dispute stopped him in the hall. She looked nervous, clutching a folder. "Are you Mr. Brooks?" she asked. "I am," he replied. "I heard about what happened," she said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't yell or fight or anything, but they heard you." Marcus paused. "Sometimes," he said, "being still is louder than shouting." She smiled, a little braver now. Then she turned and walked into her hearing, standing taller. Inside her courtroom, the judge asked her name twice just to get it right. And outside, Marcus walked on, not seeking credit, not needing applause, just moving forward. Like always, through a system that had tried to shrink him, and now, quietly, was beginning to expand, not because of outrage, but because dignity had walked into a room, stood its ground, and refused to flinch. And the room had changed. Months passed. The courthouse returned to its daily rhythm. Hearings, motions, brief nods exchanged in passing. But something in the walls had shifted, like a building learning to breathe differently. One afternoon, a first-year law clerk, young, black, soft-spoken, sat across from Marcus in the courthouse library. He'd heard the story, everyone had, but no one said it aloud. "I want to make a difference," the young man said quietly. Marcus looked up from his notes and replied, "Then remember this: show up, stay calm, and let your presence speak. Most people don't expect you to last. That's why lasting changes things. The clerk nodded, unsure whether he understood yet. But he would. That night, Judge Angela Brooks returned home later than usual. Marcus was already seated on the porch, watching the street, book unopened, in his lap. She sat beside him. No words passed between them. None were needed. Some victories don't make noise. They don't trend. They don't headline. They just settle into the foundation of a place. Quiet proof that dignity, when protected, has the power to reshape everything around it. And when the system sees you as less, yet you still walk with your full height intact, that is resistance. That is revolution. That is how justice begins. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone see what quiet strength can do. Let them feel what respect truly means.